He built an empire worth billions, but the one thing he couldn't build was a reason to come home. For 7 years after losing his wife, Woo Jin Han filled his life with silence, work, and the quiet guilt of a man who believed he'd failed the only person who ever mattered. He told himself he was done, that love was a country he'd already visited, and the visa had expired. Then, a woman he barely knew sat across from him in an empty restaurant on a Tuesday night and asked him to marry her. Not as a joke, not as a business arrangement. She meant it. And the worst part, the part that kept him awake for the first time in 7 years, was that he wanted to say yes. This is a story about grief and gravity. About a man who thought he was too old, too broken, too late. And the woman who looked at all of that and said, "I disagree." Before we begin, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. And if this one moves you, leave a comment. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Now, let's begin. The fog rolled into San Francisco the way it always did in late October, slowly, like a secret the city was keeping from itself. It crept over Twin Peaks, slid down the hills of Pacific Heights, and by the time it reached the Mission District, it had swallowed the last of the daylight whole. The streetlights along Valencia Street flickered on one by one, and inside a narrow storefront with gold lettering that read Saffron, a woman was doing what she did best, turning raw ingredients into something that made strangers close their eyes and forget where they were. Nia Prescott had opened Saffron 4 years ago with a second mortgage, a stolen recipe for saffron butter that her grandmother would have killed her for sharing, and the kind of stubbornness that made banks nervous. The restaurant seated 32. On a good night, she turned every table twice. On a great night, she turned them 3 times and still had to turn people away at the door. The San Francisco Chronicle had called it one of the 10 best new restaurants in the city. Nia had framed the article, hung it in the bathroom, and gone back to work. She wasn't the kind of woman who stopped to admire what she'd built. She was the kind who looked at it, found the cracks, and started fixing. But tonight wasn't about the restaurant. Tonight was about the man at table 9. He'd started coming in 8 months ago, early March, the first week of spring, when the city was shaking off the last of the winter rain. He'd walked in alone, no reservation, and asked for a table in the corner. He'd ordered the tasting menu without looking at it, eaten slowly, paid in cash, tipped 40%, and left without saying more than 6 words to the server. Nia wouldn't have noticed him at all if it hadn't been for the way he sat, perfectly still, like a man who had practiced being invisible and gotten too good at it. He came back the following Tuesday. Same table, same order, same silence. By the 4th week, Nia had started calling him Tuesday in her head. By the 8th week, she'd learned his name from the reservation he finally started making, Woo Jin Han. By the 12th week, she'd Googled him, and the results had made her put her phone down and stare at the ceiling for a long time. Woo Jin Han, 54 years old, founder and chairman of Hana Ventures, one of the most influential venture capital firms in the Bay Area, early investor in 3 companies that had gone public and 2 more that had been acquired for amounts that required scientific notation. Net worth estimated somewhere north of $4 billion. Widower, 1 daughter. His wife, Mi Young, had died 7 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. The obituary was short and elegant and said nothing about what it had cost him. Nia had read it twice, closed her phone, and gone back to her kitchen. She didn't feel sorry for him. That wasn't what this was. She'd lost people too. Her father to a heart attack when she was 19. Her first business partner to a betrayal that had nearly bankrupted her. She knew what grief looked like when it settled into a person's bones and started redecorating. She recognized it in the way Woo Jin held his wine glass without drinking from it, in the way he watched other diners laugh like he was studying a language he used to speak. What she felt was something more dangerous than pity. She felt recognition. The weeks turned into months. The 6 words became 12, then 20. He started lingering after the last course, and Nia started finding reasons to walk past his table, refilling water that didn't need refilling, adjusting a candle that was perfectly fine. One night in July, she sat down across from him for the first time and asked if the risotto was too salty. It wasn't. They both knew that wasn't the question. They talked for 40 minutes that night. About food, about the fog, about a documentary on fermentation that they'd both watched independently and had strong opinions about. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced without warning, like a fish breaking the surface of still water. She laughed harder than she had in months. And when she looked up, she caught something in his expression that disappeared before she could name it. By September, the 40 minutes had become an hour. By October, it was 2 hours, and the staff had stopped pretending not to notice. Her sous chef, Dio, had taken to leaving a second glass of wine on the counter without being asked. "For your Tuesday," he'd say, and Nia would roll her eyes and take it to table 9 anyway. She knew what was happening. She was falling for a man who had no intention of being caught. Woojin was kind. He was thoughtful. He remembered details she'd mentioned weeks earlier. The name of her grandmother's cat, the specific type of olive oil she preferred, the fact that she hated cilantro with a passion that bordered on ideological. But he never made a move. Never touched her hand across the table. Never suggested they meet outside the restaurant. He came. He talked. He left. Like clockwork. Like penance. And Nia, who had never in her life waited for a man to decide he was ready, made a decision of her own. It was the last Tuesday of October. The restaurant had closed an hour ago. The kitchen was dark, the chairs were up on most of the tables, and the only light came from the pendant lamp over table 9, where Woojin sat with the remains of a dessert he hadn't touched. Nia poured herself a glass of the wine Dio had left, a burgundy, something expensive that Woojin had brought, and sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fog pressed against the windows like it was trying to listen. "I need to ask you something." She leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. "And I need you to not overthink it." He looked at her with the careful attention of a man who overthought everything. "That's not a promising start. Marry me." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. His face went through something she couldn't track. Surprise, confusion, and then something deeper and more painful that moved across his features like weather. "Naya, I'm serious. I know what this looks like. I know what you're going to say, that we barely know each other, that this is impulsive, that I'm too young, that you're too old, that you've already had your shot, and the universe doesn't give second chances to people who wasted the first one. I know the whole speech because I've watched you rehearse it every Tuesday for 8 months. You sit there and you almost say something and then you don't. And you go home to that enormous house on the hill and you sit in the dark and you tell yourself this is what you deserve." She paused. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. "You're wrong. You deserve this. You deserve someone who sees you. And I see you, Woojin. I've been seeing you since March." He set the wine glass down very carefully, like he was afraid of breaking something much more fragile than crystal. "You don't know what you're asking for." His voice was low, stripped of the careful composure he wore like armor. "I'm 54 years old. I have a teenage daughter who still sets a place at the table for her mother. I go to sleep every night next to a photograph of a woman I couldn't save, and I wake up every morning, and the first thing I feel is that I should have done more. That's what you'd be marrying, not me, my ghost. I'm not afraid of ghosts. You should be. And you should be afraid of dying in that house alone, but that doesn't seem to stop you from trying." The words landed like a stone in still water. He stared at her, and she saw the exact moment the wall he'd built, 7 years of careful, meticulous isolation, developed its first crack. But cracks aren't collapses, not yet. "You're extraordinary." The gentleness in his voice was worse than any rejection she'd ever received. "And you deserve someone who isn't. Broken." She stood up. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that, not because she was proud, but because crying would make it about her pain. And this wasn't about her pain. This was about his. "I disagree." The word was simple, unadorned, But I'm not going to argue with you tonight. You know where to find me." She picked up her wine glass, walked to the kitchen, and didn't look back. Woo-jin sat at table 9 for another 20 minutes. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the fog. He drove home to Pacific Heights in silence. The house was a 4-story Victorian that he and Mi Young had bought when Soo-min was 3, back when the view of the Golden Gate Bridge from the master bedroom had felt like a promise. Now it felt like a postcard from a life that belonged to someone else. Soo-min was asleep. The hallway was dark. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, watching her breathe, and thought about all the ways a person could be alive and still not be living. In his bedroom, Mi Young smiled at him from the photograph on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed and pressed his palms against his eyes. For the first time in 7 years, he couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt, because of possibility. And that terrified him more than grief ever had. He told himself he wouldn't go back. He lasted 9 days. On the second Wednesday of November, Woo-jin walked into Saffron at 8:15, 30 minutes before closing. Nia was behind the bar, drying glasses, and when she looked up and saw him, she didn't smile, she didn't frown, she just nodded once, like he'd answered a question she hadn't asked yet, and poured him a glass of the burgundy without being asked. They didn't talk about the proposal. They talked about a heat wave in late-season San Francisco, about a new supplier Nia was considering for her winter menu, about whether sourdough was a personality trait or a bread. It was careful and light and completely dishonest, and they both knew it. But he came back. Every Tuesday and now every other Thursday. He told himself it was because the food was good. And it was, extraordinary even. But the lie was getting thinner with each passing visit, translucent as parchment held up to the light. The shift was so gradual that he almost didn't notice. Almost. One morning in late November, his assistant, Mrs. Kang, a woman who had worked for him for 15 years and had the emotional radar of a bat, looked at him across the conference table and said, "You're leaving early again." Not a question, not a complaint. Just an observation delivered with the surgical precision of someone who had watched him grind himself into dust for 7 years and was cautiously, almost superstitiously, hopeful. "I have a dinner meeting." "You've had a dinner meeting every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 weeks. It's a complicated deal." "I'm sure it is." He left early anyway. At home, the shift was harder to hide. Soo-min had her mother's eyes, not in color or shape, but in the way they noticed things that were designed not to be noticed. She was 16 and brilliant in the quiet, devastating way of children who had learned too early that the world could take things from you without warning. She spoke 3 languages, played cello with mechanical precision and no joy, and had exactly 2 friends, both of whom she kept at a careful, calibrated distance. She noticed the changes in her father, the way a seismologist notices tremors, small vibrations that preceded something larger. He hummed in the kitchen. He wanted to know about school, not out of parental obligation, but genuine curiosity. One evening, she walked past his study and heard him laughing. Actually laughing at something on his phone. And the sound was so foreign that she stopped in the hallway and stood there for a full minute, trying to remember the last time she'd heard it. She couldn't. Soo-min was not the kind of daughter who snooped. She was the kind who observed, catalogued, and drew conclusions with a precision that would have made a detective envious. It took her 2 weeks to determine that the change in her father was connected to a restaurant in the Mission District. It took her another 3 days to find it. She went on a Saturday afternoon, after her cello lesson, without telling anyone. The restaurant was smaller than she'd expected. Just a narrow room with exposed brick and warm light, and the smell of something so good that it made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand. The lunch rush was over. There were only a few tables occupied, and behind the bar, a woman was writing something in a notebook, her pen moving fast, her brow furrowed in concentration. Soo-min sat at the bar. The woman looked up. "Can I get you something?" "Kitchen's between services, but I can put together something from what's prepped." "Just water, please." The woman poured it and set it down. "You waiting for someone?" "Not exactly." Sumin wrapped both hands around the glass. My name is Sumin. I think you know my father. The pen stopped moving. Something shifted in the woman's face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of rearrangement, like a room adjusting to new light. Woo Jin-han's daughter. Yes. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Sumin studied the woman the way she studied everything, carefully, without judgment, looking for data. What she found wasn't what she expected. She expected glamour, or calculation, or the particular brand of aggressive warmth that characterized the women who occasionally appeared at her father's corporate events, circling him like satellites around a planet that gave off no heat. This woman was none of those things. She was still. She was present. She looked at Sumin like she was a person, not a problem to be solved or a gatekeeper to be charmed. He doesn't know I'm here. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. I'd prefer if it stayed that way. Okay. No argument, no questions about why, just that. I wanted to see the place that makes my father leave work before 7 o'clock. Something flickered across the woman's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. It's just a restaurant. Nothing that changes a person is ever just anything. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than a 16-year-old's words had any right to be. The woman set her notebook down and leaned against the bar with both hands flat on the surface. I'm Nia. And if you're hungry, I make a saffron butter pasta that I've been told is unreasonably good. Sumin stayed for 2 hours. They talked about food. Sumin had opinions about food. Strong ones that she rarely shared because her father ate for sustenance and Mrs. Kang ate for efficiency, and neither of them understood that food could be a language. Nia understood. They talked about music, about San Francisco, about the particular loneliness of being the smartest person in a room full of people who weren't paying attention. Sumin didn't mention her mother. Nia didn't ask. When she left, Nia handed her a brown paper bag with 2 containers of soup. For the road. And then, softer, almost as an afterthought. He talks about you, you know. Every time he's here, you're the only thing that makes his voice sound like it's coming from somewhere real. Sumin took the bag and walked 6 blocks to the BART station before she let herself cry. The discovery happened the way discoveries always do in families built on careful silence, suddenly, and with consequences. Woo Jin found the saffron takeout container in the recycling bin on a Sunday morning. He recognized the logo, the golden swirl of saffron threads that Nia had designed herself. He stood in the kitchen holding the container and felt something cold move through his chest, followed immediately by something hot. His daughter had gone to Saffron. His daughter had met Nia. His daughter had been folded into the one space he'd been keeping separate from everything else. The one room in his life where he was allowed to be something other than a widower, a father, a chairman, a ghost. He found Sumin in her room, doing homework with headphones on. You went to the restaurant. She took off the headphones. Yes. I didn't tell you about. You didn't have to. You started coming home with saffron on your cuffs. You hum now. You asked me last week what I thought about the concept of happiness as a practice rather than a state, which is something you have never asked me in 16 years of being my father. It wasn't hard to figure out. The precision of it gutted him. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right, and because the fact that she'd noticed meant she'd been watching, and the fact that she'd been watching meant she'd been worried, and the fact that she'd been worried meant he'd failed her in yet another way he hadn't calculated. You should have told me. His voice came out harder than he intended. You don't know this person. You don't know. She made me pasta and asked me about cello. She didn't try to be my mother, and she didn't try to be my friend. She just talked to me like I was a person, which, for the record, is not something that happens to me very often. He sat on the edge of her bed. The anger drained out of him, leaving something worse in its place. The raw, unprocessed terror of a man whose carefully constructed world was developing cracks in every direction. And this isn't... we're not... Dad. Her voice was gentle and unbearably old. "It's okay to not have the sentence for this yet." He left her room without finishing the conversation, because he didn't know how to finish it without admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. The almost kiss happened on a Thursday night in early December, when the rain was coming down sideways and the restaurant was empty, and Nia was testing a new dessert, a dark chocolate torte with smoked sea salt that was either a masterpiece or a disaster. She couldn't tell. Woojin came in soaked, apologetic, later than usual. She handed him a towel and a plate of the torte and stood across the bar while he tasted it. He closed his eyes when the chocolate hit his tongue, and the expression on his face was so unguarded, so entirely without defense, that she forgot to breathe. "This is extraordinary." His voice was low, unguarded, and he wasn't talking about the torte. She knew. He knew she knew. The space between them condensed. She leaned forward. He didn't move away. She could feel the warmth of him through the bar, could see the pulse in his throat, the slight tremor in his hand as he set down the fork. And then he stepped back. Not physically. He didn't move. But something behind his eyes closed, like a door shutting in a house she'd almost been invited into. The distance returned. The composure, the careful, practiced absence of want. Nia straightened up. She didn't chase. She'd never been someone who chased. "And I'm not going to wait forever, Woojin." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her everything. "But I haven't given up on you yet." He left 20 minutes later. She locked the door behind him, pressed her forehead against the cold glass, and let out a breath she'd been holding since March. It started with a delivery. 3 days after the almost kiss, Nia's regular produce supplier called to cancel. Truck broke down, driver quit, the usual cascade of small disasters that turned restaurant ownership into an endurance sport. She was in the walk-in cooler at 6 a.m, inventorying what she had left and doing math in her head, when someone knocked on the kitchen door. Woojin stood on the loading dock in a cashmere overcoat that cost more than her monthly rent, holding 2 crates of heirloom tomatoes and a bag of shallots. Mrs. Kang knows a farmer in Sonoma. He held the crates out as if Billionaire's personally delivering produce at dawn were a perfectly normal occurrence. "These are from his winter greenhouse. He says the tomatoes are ugly, but the flavor is exceptional." She stared at him. "When you're delivering vegetables." "I'm solving a supply chain problem. It's what I do." At 6 a.m, "I'm an early riser." She took the crates without another word, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her work for 20 minutes before she handed him an apron and told him to start peeling shallots if he was going to stand there anyway. He stayed until noon. That was the beginning of the surrender. Not a single dramatic moment, but a series of small capitulations that accumulated like snow. He started appearing at the restaurant during off hours, first with excuses. The farmer had more produce, his driver was in the area, he needed to review a contract, and the Wi-Fi at his office was down, which was a lie so transparent it was almost insulting. Then, without excuses, he'd sit at the bar with his laptop while she prepped for dinner service, and they'd orbit each other in comfortable silence, occasionally colliding in conversation about nothing important and everything essential. He fixed the dishwasher on a Tuesday. It had been making a sound like a dying seal for 3 weeks, and Nia had been putting off calling a repair service because the estimate was $700 she didn't want to spend. Woojin took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and had it running in 40 minutes. Where did a venture capitalist learn to fix a dishwasher? Nia leaned against the counter, genuinely mystified. "I wasn't always a venture capitalist. When I first came to California, I was 23, and I worked in a restaurant kitchen in Oakland. I washed dishes for 2 years before I saved enough to start my first company." It was the most he'd ever told her about his past in a single sentence, and she handled it the way she handled a perfect ingredient, with respect, without fuss, letting it speak for itself. He took her to Baker Beach on a Sunday afternoon in mid-December. Not a date. He was very careful not to call it a date. "There's something I want you to see." That was what he told himself the outing was about, showing her the view of the Golden Gate Bridge from the beach at sunset, when the fog lifted just enough to let the light through and the bridge looked like it was burning. They walked along the sand with their shoes off, and the Pacific was cold and endless and indifferent to whatever was happening between them. Nia talked about her grandmother, a woman named Lorraine, who had raised her in Atlanta after her father died, who had taught her to cook by feel rather than measurement, who had once told her that the secret to a good life was the same as the secret to a good meal. Use the best ingredients you can find, don't rush the process, and never apologize for how much space you take up at the table. She sounds formidable. There was warmth in his voice, and something close to reverence. She died 3 years ago. I named the restaurant after her favorite spice. Saffron? She believed it was proof that the most valuable things in the world come from the smallest, most fragile sources. He stopped walking. The sun was low and golden, and the bridge was doing the thing with the light that he'd wanted her to see. But he wasn't looking at the bridge. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was one that Nia would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was simple. It was the face of a man who was realizing, with the slow, devastating clarity of a wave pulling back from the shore, that he was already in love and had been for months. He didn't say it. He wasn't ready. But the fact of it was there between them, as real and undeniable as the ocean. Hey, Nia, don't. She shook her head. Don't say anything you're going to take back tomorrow. He closed his mouth. They walked back to the car in silence, and when he dropped her off at Saffron, she got out and then leaned back through the window. For the record, she leaned back through the window. I'm not going to be the one who breaks first. You are. I'm just making sure you know that. She was right. He broke 3 days later. It was a Wednesday, not even a Tuesday, not their day. And it was raining, and the restaurant was closed, and Nia was in the kitchen developing a new dish, flour on her forearms, and music playing too loud for her to hear the knock. He let himself in through the back door. She'd given him the code 2 weeks earlier in a gesture of trust that she'd played off as practical necessity, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her work. She turned and saw him, and for a single, unguarded moment, her face showed everything she'd been so careful to keep hidden. The wanting, the patience, the exhaustion of waiting for someone to choose you. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and kissed her. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't the kind of kiss that happens in movies, perfectly lit and perfectly timed. It was desperate and clumsy, and tasted like the rain on his coat and the flour on her hands. And it carried the weight of 7 years of loneliness and 8 months of proximity, and one impossible proposal on a Tuesday night in October. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, she pressed her forehead against his and whispered, "Took you long enough?" He laughed. A real laugh, rusty with disuse, cracking at the edges like something being opened for the first time in years. I'm going to be terrible at this. His voice was muffled against her hair. I know, I don't care. I have no idea what I'm doing. Neither do I. We'll figure it out. They stood in the kitchen for a long time, not kissing, just holding on. 2 people at the edge of something that felt enormous and fragile and terrifyingly real. That night, Woo-jin went home and did something he'd been unable to do for 7 years. He picked up Mi-young's photograph from the nightstand, the one he saw first thing every morning and last thing every night, the one that had become less a memory and more a mirror reflecting everything he'd failed to be, and he moved it to the bookshelf across the room. Not to forget. He would never forget, but to make space. For the first time since Mi-young died, the nightstand was empty, and the emptiness didn't feel like loss. It felt like permission. Sumin found the photograph in its new place the next morning. She stood in the doorway of his bedroom, looking at the bookshelf, and then at the empty nightstand, and then at her father, who was sitting on the edge of the bed putting on his shoes like it was any other morning. "You moved the picture." "I did." She was quiet for a long time. Then she walked over and adjusted the frame so it was straight, and left the room without another word. But that evening, for the first time in 3 years, she practiced cello without being reminded. And the piece she chose wasn't from her lesson book. It was something slower, sadder, more beautiful. Something that sounded like both an ending and a beginning. Woojin sat in his study and listened, and the tears that ran down his face were the first ones in 7 years that weren't made of guilt. The storm came in January, and it came with the face of a woman who had been drowning in her own grief for 7 years and didn't know any other way to breathe. Hyejeong Park had been Mi Young's mother, was still Mi Young's mother, would always be Mi Young's mother, even though motherhood, when your child is dead, becomes a title without a country. She was 69 years old. She had buried her only daughter. She had survived it the way some people survive earthquakes, by standing perfectly still and refusing to acknowledge that the ground had moved. She visited the Pacific Heights house every Sunday for dinner with Sumin. It was a ritual that had calcified into something closer to obligation than affection. Stilted meals in a dining room that echoed, conversations that circled the same safe harbors of school and weather, and Sumin's cello progress. Woojin endured them out of duty and something adjacent to love, a respect for the woman his wife had come from, even though their relationship had never been warm. Hyejeong had always believed her daughter had married too young, too quickly, and into a life that was too large. The cancer had confirmed, in her private arithmetic of blame, that the stress of being Woojin Han's wife had been a contributing factor. She'd never said this out loud. She hadn't needed to. The discovery happened on a Sunday in mid-January. Sumin, who was 16, and therefore constitutionally incapable of sustained deception, mentioned the restaurant. It wasn't deliberate. They were talking about food. Sumin was describing a dish she'd eaten recently, a saffron butter pasta with roasted winter vegetables, and the enthusiasm in her voice, the specificity of the description, triggered something in Hyejeong's radar. She wanted to know where Sumin had eaten it. The name of the restaurant slipped out before Sumin could stop herself. Hyejeong filed the information and said nothing for 2 weeks. Then she made inquiries. Hyejeong Park was not a woman who Googled. She made inquiries, the old-fashioned way, through a network of Korean community connections in the Bay Area that operated with the efficiency and discretion of an intelligence service. Within 4 days, she knew everything. The restaurant, the woman, the Tuesday nights, the Sunday walks, the dishwasher. She arrived at the Pacific Heights house on a Wednesday evening without calling ahead, which was itself an act of war. Woojin was in his study. Sumin was at a friend's house. The housekeeper let Hyejeong in and retreated to the kitchen with the instincts of someone who recognized incoming weather. Hyejeong stood in the doorway of the study holding a leather bag that Woojin recognized. It had been Mi Young's, a bag she'd carried everywhere, and the sight of it in her mother's hands sent a jolt of something through his sternum that he couldn't name. We need to talk." Her voice was controlled, precise, built on a foundation of fury that she'd spent 2 weeks constructing. "Hyejeong, don't." She sat in the chair across from his desk and placed the bag on the surface between them like evidence. "I know about the woman. I know about the restaurant. I know that my granddaughter has been going there, eating there, forming an attachment to someone who has no right to her affection. That's not. I know that you've been seeing this woman for months, that you've been involved." The word landed like a medical diagnosis. "And I need you to tell me, Woojin, because I need to hear you say it. Have you forgotten my daughter?" The question hit him the way questions like that always do. Not in the mind, but in the body. Somewhere behind the ribs where language doesn't reach. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Hyejeong opened the leather bag and removed a stack of photographs. Mi Young at their wedding. Mi Young holding Sumin as an infant. Mi Young in the hospital. Thin and translucent and still smiling, always smiling, because she believed that dying with grace was the last gift she could give to the people who loved her. Then she removed the letter. She wrote this during her treatment. Hyejeong's voice finally cracked, the controlled facade splitting along a fault line that ran all the way down to bedrock. "She gave it to me 2 weeks before she died. She wanted me to keep it. To give it to you if there was ever a time when you needed to remember." The letter was 2 pages. Mi-young's handwriting, small, neat, angular. The handwriting of a woman who had been an architect before she was a mother, before she was a patient, before she was a memory. Woo-jin read it at his desk with his hands shaking, and the words came at him like stones. She had written about the night Soo-min was born, how he'd held the baby with both hands like she was made of light and whispered promises in Korean that he thought Mi-young couldn't hear. She'd written about their first apartment in Cupertino, the one with the broken heating and the view of a parking lot, how they'd eaten convenience store ramen and planned empires on napkins. She'd written about the diagnosis, about the fear, about the mornings when she woke up, and the first thing she felt was his hand on her back, and how that hand was the difference between surviving and surrendering. And she'd written this: I keep fighting because of you and Soo-min. Not because I think I'll win. I stopped believing that months ago. But because every day I'm alive is a day you don't have to learn how to be without me. I'm buying you time, my love. Please don't waste it. Woo-jin put the letter down. He stared at the surface of his desk. The silence in the room was absolute and terrible. She fought for you. Hee-jung's tears were falling openly now, running down the weathered landscape of a face that had been carved by 7 years of a grief she refused to set down. Every day, every treatment, every morning she woke up in agony and chose to keep going. She did it for you. And now you've replaced her with a stranger. I haven't replaced. You moved her photograph. Soo-min told me. You moved her picture from your nightstand to a shelf, like she was a book you'd finished reading. The cruelty of the image was precise and devastating, and it hit its target. Woo-jin felt something inside him collapse. Not slowly, not in stages, but all at once. Like a building that had been structurally compromised for years and finally met the weight it couldn't bear. You're right. The words scraped out of him. You're right. He didn't know what he was agreeing with. The guilt. The accusation. The idea that moving forward was the same as moving away. All of it. None of it. It didn't matter. The letter was on his desk, and Mi-young's handwriting was in front of him, and the woman who had given birth to his dead wife was crying in his study, and the careful, fragile thing he'd been building with Nia over the past months. The hope, the possibility, the terrifying suggestion that he might be allowed to be happy again, crumbled under the weight of a grief he'd never actually processed, only managed. Hee-jung left an hour later. The photographs and the letter stayed on the desk. Woo-jin moved the photograph back to the nightstand that night. He stopped going to Saffron. No call, no text, no explanation. He simply vanished, the way he had been vanishing for 7 years. Into work, into silence, into the enormous echoing house on the hill where every room was a monument to a woman who wasn't coming back. Nia noticed his absence the first Tuesday. She set his usual place at table 9, uncorked the burgundy, and waited. By 10 o'clock, the wine was untouched and the table was empty, and she stood in the kitchen with her hands pressed flat against the cold steel of the prep counter, breathing carefully, deliberately, the way she breathed through a kitchen fire, steady, controlled, one thing at a time. She didn't call him. She understood, with the bone-deep instinct of a woman who had spent her life reading people the way she read ingredients, that whatever had happened was not something she could fix by reaching out. He wasn't ghosting her. He was drowning, and drowning people couldn't answer the phone. A week passed, then 2. Soo-min stopped coming to Saffron. Nia texted her once, just checking in, no pressure, and received a reply that was polite and vague and heartbreaking in its careful distance. Things are complicated right now. I'm sorry. Nia read the text, set her phone face down on the bar, and went back to work. She didn't cry. Crying was something she did in private, in her apartment, at 2 a.m, with the lights off and the sounds of Valencia Street below her window. And even then, only once. She gave herself one night to feel the full weight of what she might be losing. Then she got up, showered, and went to the restaurant, because the tomatoes weren't going to prep themselves. And grief, unlike sourdough, didn't improve with time. Woo Jin, meanwhile, was doing what he'd done best for 7 years, performing the absence of pain. He went to the office. He took meetings. He evaluated startups and signed term sheets and sat in boardrooms with his hands folded and his face composed and absolutely nothing behind his eyes. Mrs. Kang stopped asking about the dinner meetings. Sumin stopped setting an extra place for Nia at the table. She hadn't been doing it deliberately, but the habit had formed without her noticing, and dismantling it felt like a second funeral. The lowest point came on a Thursday night in late January, 3 weeks after Hyejung's visit. Woo Jin was alone in his study at midnight, the house dark, Sumin asleep, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. He sat at his desk with the letter in one hand and his wedding ring in the other. He still wore it, had never taken it off, and the weight of it on his finger had become so familiar that he only noticed it when he thought about Nia, which was the problem. He tried to remember Mi Young's voice, not her face. Her face was everywhere, in photographs and in Sumin's expressions, and in the particular way light fell through the bedroom window in the morning. But her voice, the sound of it, the way his name sounded in her mouth, the way she laughed, the specific frequency of her breathing when she fell asleep beside him. He couldn't. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and felt the horror of it. That grief, which he had treated as a permanent resident, was in fact a tide, and it had been going out for years without his permission, carrying pieces of her with it. He was losing her, not to death. That had already happened. He was losing her to time, to the ruthless biological fact that memory was not a recording but a reconstruction, and every reconstruction was slightly less accurate than the one before. And the terrible, shameful truth, the one he could barely let himself think, was that the guilt of forgetting her was worse than the guilt of loving someone else. Because loving Nia meant Mi Young was in the past, but forgetting Mi Young's voice meant she was disappearing, and he was the one letting it happen. He sat in the dark for a very long time. When he finally stood, his body ached like he'd been carrying something heavy for miles. He walked to the bedroom, placed the wedding ring on the nightstand next to Mi Young's photograph, and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers. He stared at the ceiling until dawn. Sumin waited 4 weeks. She was patient because she'd learned patience from watching her father practice it like a religion. The patience of a man who could outlast anything because he'd already survived the worst thing. But patience and paralysis were different animals, and by the first week of February, she could no longer tell which one her father was feeding. He was retreating. She could see it. The slow, methodical withdrawal into the version of himself she'd grown up with. The one who functioned without living, who performed fatherhood without inhabiting it. The humming had stopped. The early departures had stopped. He came home at 9 o'clock every night, ate dinner alone in the kitchen, and disappeared into his study with the door closed. The house was exactly the way it had been before, silent, pristine, and suffocating. She found him on a Saturday evening, sitting in the study with the lights off, Mi Young's letter on the desk in front of him. He didn't hear her come in. He was reading the letter again. She could tell because his lips were moving, the way they always did when he was trying to memorize something, as if repetition could turn words into permanence. Dad. He looked up. In the dim light, she could see the hollows under his eyes. The way exhaustion had carved channels in a face that used to be merely serious, but was now something closer to vacant. You should be in bed. Automatic. A script he'd been running for years. And you should be alive, but we can't all get what we want. The sharpness of it surprised them both. Sumin hadn't planned to say it. She'd planned to be careful, diplomatic, to approach the conversation the way she approached everything, with calibrated precision and emotional distance. But she'd been watching her father die by inches for 7 years, and the woman who had made him stop dying had been erased like a mistaken pencil. And the careful, calibrated part of Sumin was tired. I found Grandma's letter. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. I read it. The color left his face. That was private. It was on your desk for 3 weeks. If you wanted it to be private, You would have locked the drawer. She sat in the chair across from him, Hye-jung's chair, though neither of them acknowledged that, and folded her hands in her lap. Mom wrote that she was buying you time. Do you remember that part? He didn't answer. Mom wrote that she kept fighting so you wouldn't have to learn how to be without her. She was buying you time, and you've spent 7 years, squandering it. You've wasted every single day she fought for. That's not fair. None of this is fair. Mom dying wasn't fair. Me growing up without her wasn't fair. You sitting in this room in the dark, reading a letter from a dead woman, while a living one waits for you to be brave enough to answer her. None of it is fair. But you know what's really not fair. You know what would actually make Mom ashamed. Her voice broke. She hadn't expected it to. She was Soo-min Han. She didn't break. She observed and concluded and maintained structural integrity at all costs. But the crack was there, and it was deep. And what came through it was not the voice of a precocious teenager, but the voice of a 9-year-old girl who had lost her mother and then spent 7 years losing her father to the same disease. Not cancer, but the refusal to survive it. She'd be ashamed to see you like this. Not because of Nia. She'd be ashamed because you stopped living, and she died so you wouldn't have to. That was her gift to you. Time. And you've turned it into a prison. The room was very quiet. I'm losing you, Dad. The tears were falling now, and she didn't wipe them away. I've been losing you since I was 9. Every day, a little more. You're here and you're not here, and I can't keep setting a place at the table for someone who's already gone. Mom's gone. And you're going too. A little more every day. And I can't stop it, and I'm 16 years old, and I shouldn't have to be the one who... She couldn't finish. The sentence dissolved into something wordless and raw. And Woo-jin sat behind his desk and watched his daughter cry and felt the last remaining support beam of the structure he'd been living in. The grief. The guilt. The careful architecture of self-punishment. Buckle and give way. He stood up. He walked around the desk. He knelt on the floor in front of her chair and pulled her into his arms, and she grabbed fistfuls of his shirt and cried the way she hadn't cried since the funeral. Ugly, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. 7 years of accumulated loss pouring out of a girl who had been too strong for too long. I'm sorry. The words disappeared into her hair, into the space where apologies go when they're too late and too small, but still necessary. I'm so sorry, Soo-min. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. They stayed like that for a long time. When she finally pulled back, her face was swollen, and her composure was in ruins, and she looked, for the first time in years, like exactly what she was. A child. A child who needed her father to be more than a monument to a woman who was never coming back. Go find her. Soo-min's voice was raw, wrecked, and absolutely certain. Please. Before she gives up on you. He drove to the Mission District with the windows down, the cold February air cutting through the car, sharpening everything. The streetlights, the buildings, the sound of his own breathing. He parked on Valencia Street and walked the 2 blocks to Saffron with his heart slamming against his ribs like something trying to escape. The restaurant was dark, closed for the night. Through the window, he could see the chairs up on the tables, the bar empty, the pendant light over table 9 switched off. He pressed his hands against the glass and felt the echo of every Tuesday night, every conversation, every moment he'd been given and wasted. He called Naya. It rang 4 times. 5. Woo-jin. Her voice was careful. Not cold. Careful. The voice of a woman who had kept a door open for 3 weeks and was running out of reasons not to close it. And where are you? A pause. Then, Baker Beach. Of course. The place he'd taken her. The place where he'd known, with the slow certainty of a man watching a sunrise, that he loved her. He drove across the city in 20 minutes. The beach was empty. It was February. It was 10 o'clock at night, and the wind off the Pacific was sharp enough to cut glass. He parked at the overlook and walked down the sandy path to the shore, And there she was, sitting on the sand with her jacket zipped to her chin, staring at the bridge. The Golden Gate was lit up against the fog, its cables glowing red-orange, suspended between the dark water and the dark sky like a structure built on faith alone. Nia didn't turn when she heard him approach. She stayed still, looking at the bridge, and the wind moved through her, and she was so perfectly herself, stubborn, luminous, immovable, that he felt his throat close. He sat down beside her. The sand was cold. The ocean was loud. The bridge burned above them like an argument for impossible things. "I'm sorry." The words came out rough, cracked at the edges. "For disappearing. For not calling. For being exactly the man you already knew I was when you sat down at my table and asked me to marry you. You are sorry." It wasn't a question. "But sorry doesn't tell me what happens next." "I know." He stared at the bridge. Then he turned to her, and what was on his face was not the composed, careful expression of a man who had rehearsed this moment. It was open and raw and terrified, and it was the most honest he'd been with another person since Mi Young died. "I'm scared. I'm going to be scared every single day. I'm going to wake up some mornings and reach for a photograph that isn't there anymore and feel like I'm betraying someone I loved. I'm going to be bad at this. Not just at first, but possibly forever. I'm going to forget anniversaries and say the wrong thing and close up without warning because I've been closed for 7 years, and that kind of damage doesn't just fix itself." He took a breath. The wind was brutal, and the sand was cold, and his hands were shaking, and he let the words come anyway. "But I would rather be scared with you than be safe without you. I would rather be bad at loving you than be good at being alone. And I know I'm late. I know I made you wait. I know you deserve someone who didn't need his 16-year-old daughter to tell him to stop being a coward. But I'm here, and I'm asking, I'm not proposing, because you already did that, and it was braver than anything I've ever done in my life. I'm asking you to let me say yes. Late and terrified and imperfect. Yes." The ocean filled the silence. The bridge glowed. Nia looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the fear started to calcify in his chest. Long enough that he began to prepare for a rejection he would have deserved. Then she reached over and took his hand. Her fingers were cold from the wind and strong from years of kitchen work, and they wrapped around his with a certainty that made him exhale for what felt like the first time in months. "My proposal still stands." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "In case you were wondering..." He laughed. It cracked through him like light through a fault line, unexpected and uncontrolled, and so full of relief that it was almost indistinguishable from crying. "Then I accept." She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her. And they sat on Baker Beach in the cold, and the wind and the dark, and watched the Golden Gate Bridge burn above them like a promise that some things, bridges, love, the human capacity to begin again, could be both impossible and real at the same time. The epilogue wrote itself slowly, the way real endings do, not with a single dramatic scene, but with an accumulation of small, ordinary moments that, taken together, amounted to a life. Spring came to San Francisco the way it always did, tentatively, like an apology for the fog. The city warmed in degrees, and so did the house in Pacific Heights. Sumin started practicing cello again, not from her lesson book, but from a collection of contemporary pieces that Nia had found at a second-hand bookshop in Hayes Valley. The music that filled the house was different now, less precise, more felt. She was still brilliant, but she was beginning to understand that brilliance without joy was just another form of obedience, and she was done obeying grief. Mrs. Kang stopped asking about the dinner meetings and started making lunch reservations for 2 at Saffron on Wednesdays, blocking the hour on Woo Jin's calendar with the notation Strategic Partnership Review, and a straight face that fooled no one. The restaurant gained a regular 3-top. Every Sunday, the same table, Woo Jin, Sumin, and whoever Sumin had decided deserved to experience Naya's cooking that week. Her cello teacher, her 2 friends. Once a boy from her chemistry class who ate 3 servings of the saffron butter pasta, and turned the color of a sunset when Sumin told him to slow down. And then one Sunday in April, Hye-jung came. She didn't announce it. She simply appeared at the restaurant door at noon, wearing a coat that was too warm for the weather, holding her handbag in front of her with both hands like a shield. Sumin saw her first and went very still. Woojin stood up from the table and felt the old tension return, the bracing, the automatic preparation for impact. But Hye-jung didn't attack. She stood in the doorway and looked at the restaurant, at the warm light, at the bar where her granddaughter was sitting, at the open kitchen where Nia was plating something with the focused grace of a person who loved what she did, and her face did something complicated and painful and ultimately, slowly, human. "I would like to try the pasta." Her voice was stiff, carefully neutral. "If there's room." Nia came out from behind the bar. She didn't smile. It wasn't a smiling moment. But she pulled out a chair and set a place and poured a glass of water. And the gesture was simple and enormous, and it said, "There is always room." Hye-jung sat down. She ate the pasta. She didn't say it was good. She was not a woman who gave compliments easily, but she ate every bite and accepted a second serving when Nia offered, and that was its own kind of language. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something slower and harder, a willingness to be in the same room as a future she hadn't chosen. It was enough. It was the beginning of enough. That evening, after Hye-jung had left and Sumin had gone upstairs and the restaurant was quiet, Nia stood behind the bar drying glasses, and Woojin sat at table 9, his table, their table, and watched her. She came. Not a question, a marvel. She did. I didn't think she would. People surprise you. That's the whole point of them. He smiled. It was still a new expression on him. Not practiced, not polished, slightly lopsided. The smile of a man who was relearning a language he'd thought he'd forgotten. "You know," he turned the wine glass in his hands. "You never told me why." "Why what?" "Why me? That night. Why you proposed to a man who was clearly, objectively, a terrible candidate for anything resembling happiness." She set down the glass. She looked at him across the bar, with an expression that was fond and fierce, and entirely without pretense. "Because you came here every Tuesday for 8 months, and never once tried to be anyone other than who you are. Because you eat slowly, and tip generously, and listen like it costs you something. Because when you look at your daughter, your whole face changes, and you don't even know it. Because you fixed my dishwasher in your $2,000 shoes. Because you brought me tomatoes at 6 in the morning and pretended it was a supply chain issue." She paused. "Because you were already the man I wanted. You just didn't know it yet." He was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, walked behind the bar, took the towel out of her hands, and kissed her, slowly, deliberately, in the restaurant where it had all started, under the pendant light that had witnessed every version of them. This kiss was different from the first one. It wasn't desperate or clumsy. It was certain. The kiss of a man who had finally stopped running from something and started running toward it. Upstairs, in the house on Pacific Heights, a photograph of Mi Young sat on a bookshelf in the master bedroom. She was smiling. The generous, unguarded smile of a person who believed that the people she loved would eventually find their way. Beside the photograph, in a small silver frame, was a new picture. Woojin and Sumin at Baker Beach, the bridge behind them, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them laughing. And on the nightstand, the one that had been empty, then full, then empty again, there was a single new object, a recipe card, written in Nia's hand, for saffron butter pasta. Some people leave you letters. Some people leave you recipes. Both are ways of saying, "I was here. I loved you. Keep going."